Okay, hello you guys. Am I standing in front of a white door? Yes, I am. You will be right in thinking that. Okay, this is my second time filming this video. I have already filmed this video, but I did not like it. I did not like it. I was not as eloquent as I wanted to be. I said half of the things that I wanted to say about these books. And I didn't like my filming spot the first time, so I am here in front of a white door to talk to you about some books, to talk to you about the books that I read in the month of November. Now, I know that I'm starting the book videos basically 2 months from the end of the year, but I have had such a good reading month this month that I said, why not share it with the world, or at least the 3 people that are gonna see this video. Anyway, I read 7 books this month and they were all pretty great, except for 2 books that I didn't like. And that is pretty good going. That is pretty good going considering that I started reading this month on the 12th. I think because I was in a very deep reading slump at the beginning of this month. I really could not find the motivation to read. But then I started and it was a good reading month. So without further ado, let's go. The first book that I read is actually a graphic novel. It is V for Vendetta. I love this. By Alan Moore and David Lloyd. This was published in the 80s and oh my god, reading this in 2020 was such a trip in every way. The things that Alan Moore writes about in this graphic novel can be found today still. That is really, really bad. That is really bad. So what is this about? Okay, this is about V, this lovely gentleman that we have on the cover. He is a freedom fighter. And what does he do? He is an anarchist. This graphic novel is all about anarchy, which is not talked about in the book, which is quite sad. Anarchy meaning without rulers and not without rules. Now, I have to tell you a little bit of backstory. I watched the movie of this story exactly 10 years ago. In 2010, I was 12. No, I was 14. I watched this movie for the first time when I was 14 and it blew me away. I loved the story and the characters so much. But I have to say, if you haven't read or watched either of them, I suggest you watch the movie first. And then you read the graphic novel because they're quite different from each other. The movie is not quite a faithful representation of the graphic novel. It's more inspired by the graphic novel. So if you haven't immersed yourself in the story yet, I suggest you watch the movie first. Otherwise you'll hate it. And I don't want you to hate a movie that I so love and it means so much to me. So yeah, this was a great social commentary and I think it's really important to read this, especially today. So yeah, that was the first book. And the second book that I read this month is actually a memoir that is really, really popular on Bookstagram and Booktube. It is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doughty. Caitlin Doughty is, I know her as a YouTuber first. I discovered her videos not long ago actually, and she is amazing. I love how she talks. I love her long bob. I love her strong fringe. I love her. But I have to say, this book was pushed so much on the platform and I wasn't quite happy with it, it's really hard to review memoirs because it's almost like you're criticizing the person's life and the fact that they weren't able to describe it at the best of their abilities. I loved Caitlin's voice in this. Her narrating voice is so great. She is so funny. She knows what she wants to say and she says it in the right and funny way. But my problem with this book is that I found myself basically more interested in the little facts that she would give us every once in a while in the book about the disposal of bodies in the USA, but especially when she talked about the disposal of bodies in the Middle Ages, because that is so interesting to me. It is a period in time that we know so little about, and hearing her very funny voice speaking about this was so interesting to me. And yeah, I found myself being more interested in those little parts of the book than the book itself. And that is not to say that her life is boring or not deserving of its own book. It's just that, yeah, maybe this was too pushed on the platform, and it didn't live up to the expectation, for me at least. I bet it's gonna be amazing for you. So I really recommend this. Even though it didn't work for me, it is still an amazing account of a person's life, and I really recommend this. Okay, then the next book that I read was Perfume by Patrick Süskind. I never know how to pronounce vowels when these little two dots are on top of them. I'm gonna go with Süskind. This was so unbelievably weird, but in a good way. I really liked this book. I gave it 4.5 stars, and it really took me by surprise. I like the narrating voice here as well. It is a kind of self-aware narrating voice, which I know can be annoying in some books if it's not done very well, but in this book it works. And what is it about? It is about Jean-Baptiste Grenouille, who was born in the 1800s, and he has this particular gift of being able to smell anything. He can smell glass, brass, he can smell everything that is around him, and especially he can smell people. And it is the smell of people and the desire to capture it that brings him to his end. Am I making any sense? This was such a unique book. I have never read anything like this. And the character, Jean-Baptiste Grenouille, is so unlike any character that I've ever encountered in my years and years of reading. And to convince you guys to pick this up and give it a try, I actually wanted to read you the first 1.5 pages. This is either gonna be really embarrassing or it's gonna convince you to pick this up. In 18th century France, there lived a man who was one of the most gifted and abominable personages in an era that knew no lack of gifted and abominable personages. His story will be told here. His name was Jean-Baptiste Grenouille, and if his name, in contrast to the names of other gifted abominations, the Sades, for instance, or Saint-Just, Fauche, Bonaparte, etc., has been forgotten today, it is certainly not because Grenouille fell short of those more famous blackguards when it came to arrogance, misanthropy, immorality, or more succinctly, wickedness, but because his gifts and his sole ambition were restricted to a domain that leaves no traces in history, to the fleeting realm of scent. In the period of which we speak, there reigned in the cities a stench barely conceivable to us modern men and women. The streets stank of manna, the courtyards of urine, the stairwell stench of moldering wood and rat droppings, the kitchens of spoiled cabbage and mutton fat. The unaired parlors stank of stale dust, the bedrooms of greasy sheets, damp feather beds, and pungently sweet aroma of chamber pots. The stench of sulfur rose from the chimneys, the stench of caustic lies from the tanneries, and from the slaughterhouses came the stench of congealed blood. People stank of sweat and unwashed clothes. From their mouths came the stench of rotten teeth, from their bellies that of onions, from their bodies, if they were no longer very young, came the stench of rancid cheese and sour milk and tumorous disease. The rivers stank, the marketplaces stank, the churches stank, it stank beneath the bridges and in the palaces. The peasant stank as did the priest, the apprentice as did his master's wife. The whole of aristocracy stank, Even the king himself stank like a rank lion, and the queen like an old goat, summer and winter. For in the 18th century, there was nothing to hinder bacteria busy at decomposition. And so there was no human activity, either constructive or destructive, no manifestation of germinating or decaying life that was not accompanied by stench. And of course, the stench was foulest in Paris, for Paris was the largest city in France. And in turn, there was a spot in Paris, so underneath the sway of particularly fiendish stench, between the Rue aux Fers and the Rue La Ferronnière, the Cimetière des Innocents to be exact. For 800 years, the dead had been brought here from the Hôtel Dieu and from the surrounding parish churches. For 800 years, day in, day out, corpses by the dozens had been carted here and tossed into long ditches, stacked bone upon bone for 800 years in the tombs and charnel houses. Only later was it finally closed and abandoned. Millions of bones and skulls were shoveled into catacombs of Montmartre, and in its place, a food market was erected. Here then, on the most putrid spot in the whole kingdom, Jean-Baptiste Grenouille was born on the 17th of July, 1738. It was one of the hottest days of the year. I mean, if this doesn't convince you to pick this up, I don't know what will. Also, a little fun fact, this was Kurt Cobain's favorite book. Moving on, the next book that I'm gonna talk about, I didn't like. I did not like it! And I feel bad because it's considered a modern classic, and it is The English Patient. I did not like this book, you guys. I did not love it. And not because the prose was bad or because it wasn't poetic, because the language used in this book was actually quite beautiful. I simply did not get the story, and I did not like any of the characters in this book. Where are we? We are in the hills outside of Florence at the end of the Second World War, so we are in 1944. And we have 4 characters in this abandoned villa outside of Florence. Who are our 4 characters, you ask? None of them are interesting. Literally none of them are interesting. Okay, we have our only female character, who is called Hannah. She is a nurse, and she is taking care of the English patient. And that's all we know about her. Yeah, she was done so dirty in this book. She was done absolutely so dirty in this book, but I'm gonna talk about that later. And then we have 3 male characters. We have, first of all, the English patient, and he is the victim of a plane crash. His plane crashed in the desert in northern Africa. And during the course of the war, he was brought to different places. And at the end of the war, he finds himself in this Italian villa being taken care of this Canadian nurse. And we know very little about him. Then we have Caravaggio. Caravaggio is the best friend of Hannah's deceased father. And in this book, he really acts like a foster father figure to Hannah. And then we have Kip. Kip is an Indian. He gets introduced very weirdly and very abruptly. And then he becomes the most important person in the book. For no reason. Oh God, I didn't get this book. I really did not get this book. And what I hated the most about it was that all the 3 men got a backstory. It is explained how they find themselves in this villa, in this particular time in history. Like, pages and pages and pages are dedicated to the description of Kip's life in the war, defusing bombs. But do you think that our girl Hannah gets even a word said about her? Absolutely not. She gets treated like shit in this book. Every time she is talked about in relation to the men that were in her life in the past, are in her life now, or are yet to be in her life. Namely, her father who died in the war, the men who are in her life now, so the English patient, Kip and Caravaggio, and the men, as I said, who are still not in her life, because a couple of times in this book she is described as childless, without lineage. She doesn't have a son. The book really wants us to know that she doesn't have a son, even though she's only 20 and probably suffers from depression and PTSD. Okay, that's enough. That's enough. I didn't like this book. Is it clear enough that I didn't like this book? But I think there is no worse thing that when you really like a book and then you find someone on YouTube who didn't like it and bashes it on the internet. So if you want to try with this book, definitely try it, because the prose is actually really beautiful. But yeah, that's the only good thing about it, because the characters are so... I didn't care about them. I didn't care about anyone in this book, but let's move on. I read Different Seasons by Stephen King. Stephen King. And what an odyssey this was to read. I read the first 2 short stories in this collection in August. And I finished the remaining 2 in November. Not because the book is so bad, but I have come to the conclusion after reading this book that probably short stories are not for me. And why is that? Because every time I finish reading one, I feel such a sense of satisfaction and such a sense of accomplishment that in my mind, I have already finished the book. Because the story has ended, I have finished the book, but no, I have 3 more to go. Also, I want to say this, the stories are actually interesting and very, very popular, because 2 of these stories are actually the Shawshank Redemption, and the 3rd story in this collection is The Body, which inspired the movie Stand By Me, as it is written on this cover. The stories, as I said, are actually quite good, but Stephen King gives us too much information. My God, this man can write. And he writes at length, too much actually. He gives us too much. I think usually the books that I like are books that give the reader some space. Stephen King is one of those authors that gives us everything. Like literally everything. We know everything about the characters, we know everything about their backstories, and we know everything about their mothers and fathers and their cousins and their pets. Do we need all that information? No. The answer is no, we don't need that. So yeah, this was still a 4-star read for me, but yeah, those are the things that I didn't like about that. Stories are actually good, but if you can get past the verbosity of Stephen King, then definitely pick this up. Oh my God. The next book that I read, you guys. The Song of Achilles. I love this book so much, and it has become one of my favorites of the year and one of my favorites of all time. This book is gonna rip you to shreds. The last 50 pages are probably the most sad and well written that I've ever read in quite some time. The characters are amazing. Except Agamemnon. Agamemnon can suck my ass. Fuck off, Agamemnon. But all the other characters I found myself loving to bits. Usually I'm quite a voracious reader, meaning that if I finish a book in the morning, I can pick another one up at 5 in the afternoon. If I finish a book in the evening, I can pick another one in the morning. But with this book, I think it was the first time in quite a while where I experienced book hangover. Like, I was so devastated by this book. It lived in my head rent-free for at least 3 days, and I couldn't read anything else because the story was so beautiful. I had fallen so much in love with all the characters that aren't in here. And then after the 3 days of hangover, I stopped and I asked myself, why is this book good though? Why did I like it, and why did it make it so soon in my favorite books of all time? I don't know if I'll be able to actually describe why this book is so important to me, because That's usually the case, isn't it? With the books that you really liked, you have very few words to describe them, but with the books that you hated, you have a lot of words to describe how bad they are. And this is the case with this book. Mainly, I want to talk about the prose style because I really, really liked it. I saw a couple of reviews on YouTube saying that the style of writing is pretty flat. And in my notes, I have actually written that the style of writing is quite monotone, but I don't think either of those adjectives are suitable for how this book is actually written. When I really analyzed it, I noticed that the sentences are quite short. They can be read in the space of a breath, basically, and that makes it seem almost like a long poem. Of course, it is a tip of the hat to the actual canonized material, you know, the Iliad. Of course, it's not gonna be for everyone, but even if you don't like the style of writing, the story is so good and it's so evocative as well. Like, you can feel the sand that they walk on. You can taste the sweetness of the figs that they eat. You can feel the love that Patroclus and Achilles feel for each other. Pick up this book. Pick up this book and read it, please. Oh, also, one last thing that I wanted to say about this book. In the summer, I actually read Circe, and I didn't like it as much. I think I gave it 3 stars and I gave this one 5. And I think I didn't like that book as much as I liked this one because that book was narrated by a god. This book is narrated by a human, our lovely Patroclus. And I think that brings the story down to earth, and it is much more, I hate to use the word relatable, but it actually is, because through Patroclus's eyes, we can see how fame and glory can totally twist a man's mind, and how horrible war is, and how unreachable these gods are. And we really feel for Patroclus. Yeah. And then we've come to our last book, the last book that I've read this month, which is so good and it took me by surprise so much, and it is The Life of Vittorio Fieri, this lovely gentleman. Okay, a little bit of backstory. Once again, I have started university exactly 5 years ago in 2015, and the first exam that I gave was an Italian literature exam, and we studied this lovely gentleman right here. Studied some parts of this book to really get a sense of how eccentric this author was, and those parts I remember was so funny that I promised myself when I have a little bit of time, I'm actually gonna read the whole autobiography. And I forgot about it for 5 years, but I've read it in the end. And this was so good and so funny and so relatable. Before starting this book, I was like, oh my god, I am reading about a rich white man who was born into money and aristocracy and who lived in the 1700s. What can be relatable about him? Everything. He is so likable, or at least he writes himself that way. He divides his life into 4 parts. The first 2 parts are his adolescence, and then the last 2 parts are his journeys and his virility, he calls it. The first 2 parts are so funny. They're so fast-paced that he tells us about his life in the north of Italy, how his family shaped him, how his education, lack of education shaped him. And then in the last 2 parts of this book, he starts to be more retrospective about his life. If you are a language student like me, this book is gonna be a gold mine for you, because there's so much language discourse. Because we have to remember that in the time period that this author lived in, Italy was still not a state. It was composed by 1,000 little states, and everyone had their own currency and everyone had their own language. The only thing that was close enough to a lingua franca was the Tuscan dialect. because I'm from Tuscany. And he says that he really is embarrassed of himself because for 27 years of his life, he wasn't even interested in learning the lingua franca because the north of Italy was so influenced by the French language that they basically were speaking French instead of Italian. And he finds himself at 27 years old wanting to pursue a career in writing, but not being able to write because he doesn't know the language. I loved, as a last thing, and then I'm gonna finish, I loved how anti-monarchy he is. Because we have to remember, this could have been quite an offense back then. He is so against the king and so against the pope, and he is so vocal about it that even though he was born into aristocracy and into a lot of money, he almost writes himself as a working class hero in an age where working class heroes weren't even a thing. So yeah, really recommend you this one. Oh, okay, if you are Italian, I really recommend this one. And the Italian that it is written in, it is quite accessible. I was able to understand every single word that was used here. But if you don't, this edition has so many notes at the end that if you don't know a word, you can just look it up. But if you're not Italian, I think it's better to pick up a translation, which I checked, and there are actually many. So yeah, these are all the books that I read in the month of November. You are going to see me with this format again next month with my December videos. But if you want to see more from me, come back to the channel in like a few days. I'm sure I'm gonna have some videos up there for you. So yeah, see ya.